Have you ever felt like your world was falling apart, no matter how hard you tried to hold it together? Like no matter what you did, things only got worse. That moment when prayers seem to go unanswered, doors keep closing, and the weight of life becomes unbearable. It's in these moments that faith is truly tested. But here's something no one tells you. Your breakthrough often comes right when you're about to give up. Faith isn't just about believing when things are going well. True faith is forged in fire, built in the hardest battles. It's what keeps you standing when everything around you is falling apart. But let's be honest. When you're struggling, when your bank account is empty, when your family is hurting, holding on to faith feels impossible. The real question is, what do you do when you feel like God is silent? Many people think that miracles only come in grand, supernatural ways, but sometimes the greatest miracles are found in small, unexpected moments. A kind word from a stranger, a verse that suddenly speaks directly to your heart, a door opening when you least expect it. But if you're blinded by despair, you might miss the very sign you've been waiting for. Maybe you're in a storm right now, and you don't see a way out. Maybe you've questioned if God even hears you. But before you give up, before you let hopelessness take over, you need to hear this. Faith is never wasted. No matter how dark things seem, no matter how silent heaven feels, you are never alone. And today, you're about to see why. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a reflection of a truth that could change your life. A truth that proves that even in the hardest moments, faith is still the most powerful force you have. So, are you ready to discover how? The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on João's shoulders as he sat in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the stack of overdue bills. Each envelope felt like a silent reminder of his failures, a cruel echo of the opportunities that had slipped through his fingers. His heart pounded with anxiety as he thought about his family. His wife Maria, who tried to stay strong, and his children, who had no idea how close they were to losing everything. Unemployment had drained João's sense of worth. He had always been a hard-working man, proud of providing for his family, but now every rejection from potential employers felt like a punch to the gut. The economy was harsh, and with each passing day, his desperation grew. How much longer could he hold on before his family lost faith in him? Before he lost faith in himself? That night, João couldn't sleep. His mind was a battlefield of worries, fears, and unanswered prayers. He paced back and forth in their small apartment, unable to escape the suffocating sense of failure. The fridge was nearly empty, and the landlord had already warned him about the overdue rent. He had done everything he could, applied for jobs, asked for help, but nothing seemed to change. Was God even listening? A single tear slid down his face as he clenched his fists. He had never felt so powerless. With nowhere else to turn, he fell to his knees in the dark, whispering a prayer that carried the last of his strength. God, I don't know what to do anymore. I need you. The words barely left his lips before a heavy silence filled the room. No voice, no sign, just emptiness. It was as if the heavens were silent. The walls of his home felt like they were closing in on him. João grabbed his coat and stepped outside, needing air, needing escape. The city streets were eerily quiet at this hour, a reflection of the void he felt inside. With each step, he wandered further from home, lost not only in the darkness of the night, but in the weight of his own despair. Back at home, Maria did her best to hold everything together. She had always been the steady force in their household, but the weight of their struggles was beginning to crack even her resilience. Every day she smiled for the children, reassured João that things would get better, and tried to stay strong. But deep inside, she was just as afraid. How much longer could they live like this? The tension in the house was thick, an invisible storm cloud hanging over their once happy home. The children, though young, could sense the change. They noticed how their parents barely spoke, how dinner portions were smaller, how their father's laughter had disappeared. Even their once joyful home felt cold, heavy with an unspoken fear that no one dared to voice. Maria often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She prayed silently, hoping for a miracle, for any sign that things would turn around. But as the days passed with no answer, doubt began to creep in. She wanted to believe, but the reality in front of her was overwhelming. Love alone wasn't enough to put food on the table or pay the rent. Faith was being tested in ways she never imagined. João, on the other hand, felt trapped between guilt and frustration. He could see the exhaustion in Maria's eyes, the forced smile she gave the children, the silent pain she carried. He wanted to fix everything, to be the man his family needed him to be, but how could he when every door seemed shut? The weight of failure crushed him, making him withdraw further into himself. The silence between them grew. Their conversations became short, mechanical, about bills, about groceries, about what to do next. Gone were the days of late-night talks and dreams of a better future. Now, every moment felt like survival, and as João wandered the streets alone, Maria sat by the window, wondering if their family could ever find its way back to what it once was. João had always prided himself on being a provider, a man who could take care of his family no matter what. But now, as rejection after rejection piled up, he felt like he was losing his very identity. Every job application that went unanswered, every interview that ended with a polite "we'll be in touch," felt like a dagger to his pride. He wasn't just unemployed. He was becoming invisible. Self-doubt crept into his mind like a shadow, whispering cruel thoughts. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'll never be able to take care of them again. He tried to push these thoughts away, but they clung to him like a weight, dragging him deeper into despair. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing not just as a worker, but as a husband and father. As the days stretched into weeks, João found himself withdrawing from everything. He avoided his children's questions, dreading the day when they would realize their father was struggling. He distanced himself from Maria, unable to face the disappointment he imagined in her eyes. Even when she assured him that they would get through this together, he struggled to believe it. At night, João lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice that had led him here. He had worked hard all his life, so why was he now in this situation? He had seen others find opportunities, even in tough times, so why did every door seem locked for him? It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about feeling like a man who had lost control over his own future. The weight of failure was suffocating, and João felt himself sinking under it. He knew he needed to find a way out, but every option seemed impossible, and with no answers in sight, his desperation only grew. But sometimes, it's in the darkest moments that a cry for help becomes inevitable. With nowhere else to turn, João found himself on his knees in the quiet darkness of his home. His hands trembled as he clasped them together, his voice barely above a whisper. "God, I need you. I don't know what to do anymore." The words carried the weight of his exhaustion, his frustration, his silent suffering. He wasn't just praying, he was pleading. Tears welled in his eyes as he poured out his heart. "I've tried everything. I've knocked on every door. I've done my best, but nothing is working." His voice cracked under the pressure of his emotions. He had never felt so lost, so unseen. In his mind, he knew God was there, but in that moment, all he could feel was silence. Was his prayer even reaching heaven? Doubt crept in, filling the spaces where hope used to be. If God was listening, why wasn't he answering? Was he being punished? Forgotten? João's faith had never been perfect, but he had always believed that God helped those in need. Now, as he sat in the depths of despair, he felt abandoned, left to face the storm alone. Minutes passed, but the silence remained. No voice, no sign, no sudden relief. Only the stillness of the night and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He wiped his tears, staring at the floor, waiting for something, anything to reassure him. But sometimes, faith isn't about immediate answers. Sometimes, faith is about holding on even when there is nothing to hold on to. João finally rose to his feet, feeling just as lost as before. But something inside him told him to move, to walk, to breathe. Without a destination in mind, he stepped out into the cold night, letting the empty streets swallow his thoughts. And as he wandered aimlessly, he had no idea that something, someone, was about to change everything. The cold night air bit at João's skin as he wandered aimlessly through the empty streets. The city, once alive with movement and voices, now felt like a hollow shell, a reflection of the emptiness inside him. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows, and each step echoed in the silence. He had no destination, only the need to escape, to walk until the weight of his thoughts became lighter. For the first time in a long time, João felt truly alone, not just physically, but in a deeper sense. He had no job, no money, and now no certainty that God was even listening. It was a terrifying feeling, like standing in the middle of an ocean with no land in sight. His mind replayed every mistake, every failed attempt, every moment that had led him to this breaking point. As he walked, memories surfaced. The first time he held his children, the vows he made to Maria, the dreams they once had together. Where had it all gone wrong? Had he been too proud to ask for help sooner? Had he missed a sign along the way? The past and present blended into one, leaving him questioning everything. For the first time, he wondered if he had lost not just his job, but himself. Passing by a dimly lit shop window, João caught his own reflection. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. His face, once full of determination, now looked worn, his eyes dull with exhaustion. When had he become this version of himself? He turned away, ashamed, but deep down he knew he couldn't keep running. He needed answers, even if he didn't know where to find them. As João continued down the deserted streets, his steps slowed. Something within him told him to stop, to breathe. The city felt different now, as if he wasn't as alone as he thought. And just when he was about to turn back, a voice, gentle yet firm, called out to him. João turned, and there, standing a few feet away, was an old man, holding out a small piece of paper. João hesitated before stepping closer. The old man stood calmly under the flickering streetlight, his eyes filled with a wisdom that felt both comforting and mysterious. He didn't seem surprised to see João. On the contrary, it was as if he had been waiting for him. Without saying a word, the man extended his hand, offering João a small piece of paper. With trembling fingers, João took it and glanced down. It wasn't money, nor an address or a job offer. It was a Bible verse, Isaiah 41 verse 10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. João read the words twice, his heart pounding. Why this verse? Why now? The old man smiled knowingly. You are not alone, he said simply. João opened his mouth to speak, to ask how this stranger knew what he was going through, but the words caught in his throat. He had prayed for a sign, for something, anything, to let him know God hadn't forgotten him. And now, here it was, right in his hands. Tears welled up in João's eyes, but this time they were different. Not tears of despair, but of something else, hope. He looked up to thank the man, but in the blink of an eye he was gone. João turned in every direction, scanning the empty street. How could he have disappeared so quickly? Had he imagined it? Or had God truly sent someone to remind him that he was still there? For the first time in weeks, João felt something shift inside him. The weight on his shoulders didn't disappear, but it felt lighter. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought. Clutching the paper tightly, he took a deep breath. His circumstances hadn't changed yet, but his heart had. And sometimes, that's where the real change begins. João walked back home with a small piece of paper clutched in his hand. His steps were slow, not because of exhaustion, but because something inside him felt different. The words of Isaiah 41 verse 10 echoed in his mind, filling spaces that had been empty for too long. Do not fear, for I am with you. Could it be that God had never left him, even when he thought he was alone? For weeks, João had felt invisible, unheard, abandoned. But now, a single encounter had reignited something inside him. He had prayed for a sign, for something to remind him that God hadn't forgotten him. And instead of a loud miracle, instead of a dramatic rescue, God had sent him a verse, one message, just enough to remind him that faith is never truly lost. As he reached his building, João stopped at the door and looked up at the sky. It was still dark, but now he noticed something he hadn't before. Stars, small but shining, breaking through the night. He took a deep breath, realizing that even in darkness, light still exists. Maybe his life hadn't changed instantly, but his heart had. And sometimes, hope is all it takes to start again. With renewed energy, João stepped inside his home. Maria was still awake, sitting at the table with worry in her eyes. Before she could ask where he had been, João placed the small piece of paper on the table. "I'm not giving up," he whispered. For the first time in a long time, Maria saw something in his eyes that had been missing: conviction. Hope had returned. His problems weren't gone, but something had shifted. João wasn't defeated anymore. He was ready to fight again. And the next morning, as he got up to search for work once more, he carried something far more powerful than money or security. He carried faith, because sometimes all it takes to change everything is the belief that things can change. The next morning, João woke up before the sun had fully risen. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel paralyzed by fear. Instead, there was something different: determination. He had no guarantees, no job offers waiting, but he had something that had been missing for too long: faith that things could change. He wasn't going to wait for life to fix itself. He was going to fight for it. He shaved, put on his best shirt, and walked out the door with purpose. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if the weight of despair had finally loosened its grip. This time, when he walked into businesses looking for work, he didn't carry himself like a man defeated. He looked people in the eye, spoke with confidence, and refused to let rejection define him. The difference wasn't in the world around him. It was in him. He had walked the same streets, knocked on the same doors, yet everything felt new. He no longer approached each opportunity as a desperate man begging for a chance. Instead, he saw himself as someone who still had value, someone who was capable. And that confidence, that unwavering faith, made all the difference. Hours passed, and though he still faced rejections, they no longer crushed him. He understood now. His journey wasn't just about finding a job. It was about finding himself again. Every rejection was no longer proof of his failure, but a stepping stone toward his breakthrough. And deep down he knew he was getting closer. As the sun began to set, João felt exhausted but not hopeless. He had done something he hadn't done in a long time. He had tried without giving up, and as he prepared to head home, something caught his eye, a small sign in a hardware store window. Help wanted. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and stepped inside. As João stepped into the hardware store, the smell of wood and metal filled the air. The place was small but busy, stocked with tools, shelves of supplies, and customers browsing. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a kind but tired expression. João hesitated for a moment before approaching. "I saw the sign outside. Are you still hiring?" The store owner glanced up, studying João for a second before nodding. "We need extra help, but it's just temporary work," he said. João didn't hesitate. "That's fine. I just need a chance." There was something different about him this time. No trace of desperation, no fear in his voice. Just determination. The owner noticed it too. "Do you have experience with tools?" he asked. João had worked many jobs before, but nothing in hardware. Still, he answered with confidence. "I'm a fast learner. Give me one day, and I'll prove it to you." The owner raised an eyebrow, but seemed impressed. "All right," he said. "Come in tomorrow morning. We'll see how you do." João felt his heart race. It wasn't a full-time job, it wasn't a career, but it was a start. As he left the store, João felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum. One step forward. A small step, but a step nonetheless. He knew this wasn't the end of his struggles, but it was proof that change was possible. The rejection he had feared so much had finally given way to an opportunity. And when he told Maria about it that night, she didn't just hear his words. She saw the fire returning to his eyes. The next morning, João showed up early, ready to prove himself. He lifted, sorted, assisted customers, working harder than he had in months. And as the day ended, the store owner patted him on the back. "You did good today," he said. "Let's see how the rest of the week goes." João smiled. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. And after everything he had been through, something was more than enough. When João walked through the door that evening, something felt different. He was still exhausted, his hands ached from the hard labor, and his future was still uncertain. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel defeated. He had spent the entire day working, not worrying. He had earned something with his own hands. And most importantly, he had hope. Maria noticed it immediately. The tension that had filled their home for weeks seemed to loosen. João wasn't carrying the same weight in his eyes. He sat down at the table, and for the first time in a long time, dinner didn't feel like a moment of quiet stress. It felt like a family again. The children, sensing the change, talked excitedly, filling the room with laughter João hadn't heard in what felt like forever. As they ate, João reached for Maria's hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered. She squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes glistening. "We're in this together." Those words hit him deeper than he expected. He had spent so much time thinking he was alone in his struggle, carrying the burden by himself. But the truth was, he had never been alone. That night, João lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but this time he wasn't drowning in worry. He was planning. He thought about how he could make the most of this job, how he could turn a temporary position into something more. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to fight for his family, for his future. The days ahead were still uncertain, but João understood something now. Faith doesn't mean having all the answers. It means moving forward even when you don't. And as he closed his eyes that night, with his wife beside him and his children sleeping peacefully, he realized something he had nearly forgotten. God had been with him the entire time. João's journey wasn't about luck or coincidence. It was about faith. He had hit rock bottom, questioned everything, and nearly lost himself in the darkness. But in the moment he thought he was completely alone, he realized something powerful. God had never left him. Even in silence, even in struggle, God was working. And sometimes the greatest miracles come in the smallest, most unexpected ways. Faith isn't just about believing when things are good. It's about holding on when everything falls apart. João learned that faith is not a feeling. It's a choice. It's choosing to keep going when you don't see the way. It's choosing to trust when nothing makes sense. And it's understanding that even when you don't get the answers you want, God is still guiding you toward something greater. The struggles didn't magically disappear, but João had changed. He was no longer the man who let failure define him. He was no longer paralyzed by fear. The strength he found wasn't just in a new job or in overcoming hardship. It was in realizing that no storm lasts forever, and that perseverance, fueled by faith, always leads to something greater. As João sat at the dinner table with his family, he understood that the biggest lesson wasn't about finding a job. It was about rediscovering purpose. Life would always have challenges, but now he knew, no matter how dark the night, the light of faith is never too far away. And when you hold on to that light, no hardship is strong enough to break you. So now, ask yourself, what struggles are you facing? Have you forgotten that God is still with you, even in the silence? Like João, you have a choice. Will you give up, or will you choose faith? Because sometimes, all it takes to change your life is the belief that it's not over yet. Life will always have challenges. There will be moments when everything seems lost, when the weight of uncertainty feels unbearable. But if João's story teaches us anything, it's this: faith is not about waiting for perfect conditions. It's about believing even when nothing makes sense. Because faith is not just a feeling, it's an action. It's the choice to keep going, even in the darkness. Maybe you've been through storms of your own. Maybe you felt like God was silent, like your prayers were hitting a wall. But what if the silence wasn't abandonment, but preparation? What if, like João, your breakthrough was waiting for you just beyond your breaking point? The question is, will you hold on long enough to see it? Your struggles don't define you. Your failures don't define you. What defines you is what you choose to do next. Will you let despair consume you, or will you rise again, trusting that God is still in control? Because the truth is, no battle lasts forever, no storm is eternal, and no situation is beyond God's power to change. If this message spoke to your heart today, don't let it stop here. Take action. Apply it to your life. And most importantly, strengthen your faith, because it is the key that unlocks doors you never thought possible. Now, I ask you, what will you do with what you've learned? Will you give up, or will you rise stronger? If this reflection helped you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more messages like this. Sometimes, all we need is one word to change everything, and maybe today, this was yours.